Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We want to welcome you to the Cultural Arts Center here on the campus, to the Museum of Southern History, and to this lecture that we're fixing to enjoy. It was my privilege to get to meet and talk and take on a tour of the museum our distinguished visitors from the Gettysburg National Battlefield Park. I'm also going to introduce a couple of them, and then one of them is going to introduce our guest speaker. I'm going to start with Sally Mcpherson. Now, I'm sure that everyone in this room will know when I say that name, Mcpherson, Gettysburg. Everybody knows. Mcpherson's Ridge, first day, Gettysburg, 1863. Well, Sally is a Dallasite. She's a little further west of that, but her husband's family indeed still own the property that sits astraddle that famous ridge just west of the downtown area of Gettysburg. When she was living in Washington, D.C., and she put on her little Vita there temporarily, she was there 4 years and she worked for the Gettysburg Foundation. During that time and subsequent to that, after she returned to Dallas, she has continued to work for the foundation primarily on getting out publicity pertaining to the museum, the visitor center that has recently been completed up there. So we want to welcome her. She has a BA from Smith College and a master's in education from Latschar College, but she really stresses that she's back in Dallas and she seems to want to be here and stay, and encourage people from Texas to go to Gettysburg and enjoy the things and learn from the experience of going there. So again, thank you very much. Sally, I worked with her quite a bit on making the arrangements for this, and boy, she does a good job on setting things up and making sure everybody gets here at the appointed hour too. My second person I'm going to introduce is going to be Robert Wilburn, down here on my right. He's the president, chief executive officer of the Gettysburg Foundation. He took that position as its first chief executive officer in August of 2000, and he has maintained that job. Now, I guess everyone would know here that that's the guy who's into the deep pockets end of that business of funding the Gettysburg National Park. In 2006, the Friends of the Gettysburg organization and the foundation merged together, and he has continued to be the executive officer of the combined organization. In addition to that, previous to his arrival in Gettysburg, he was at the Williamsburg community. Most of you know about Williamsburg, Virginia, and the colonial reenactments that they have there. But he was with the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the fundraising arm. I think it's very interesting to see that while he was there and under his direction, they reversed a decline in attendance. They increased their membership, their attendance, and their funding went up during his involvement there. And he attributes that a lot to interactive programming. I oftentimes refer to that as living history program, where people put on demonstrations of a rifle maker or a cobbler or something like that and identify themselves with that period of time. Before that, he was at the Carnegie Institute in Pennsylvania during the mid-1980s, where he did the very same thing. One, he was the chief executive officer, and he also tripled the membership of the Carnegie Institute during his involvement with that organization, saw their attendance increase sharply, as he puts, and the donations soared. Maybe we need to be talking about getting him down here in the Houston area, very close to where we are. Before going to the Carnegie Institute, and this is the thing that really intrigued me about him, he was a part of the Pennsylvania State Administration. He was an appointee as the Secretary of Budget and Administration and as the Secretary of Education for Governor Thornburg in his cabinet and his organization that ran. His high note there is that despite having to deal with 23 separate unions of employees, in 4 years he developed 4 consecutive balanced budgets with no tax increases. It would be my wish that we could nominate him for the next President of the United States if people were of such a mind to do so. Before that, he was at Indiana University in Pennsylvania, Chase Bank, and also served in a previous U.S. governmental position where it's very interesting. He worked in policy development, but also the legislation that created the all-volunteer American military forces. It's our pleasure, and I wish you would agree by signifying it with applause to welcome Mr. Wilburn here, and he will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. A very nice introduction, and also for the wonderful tour that you gave of the museum. It's really quite impressive, the breadth of the museum and the period of history that you cover and how well it's covered in the museum. We enjoyed that quite thoroughly. When I was approached about coming to Gettysburg to actually start to help set up and establish the Gettysburg Foundation, you know, to me it was Gettysburg. The name just resonated with me, and it does with so many people. In fact, Gettysburg every year attracts some 2 million visitors. And you ask yourself, why is that? Why is this site so popular with people, and why do so many people go? Well, clearly it is one of the most important historic sites in the country. And it is a place where the largest battle in this continent certainly ever occurred, and with the greatest American casualties of all time. But more than that, it also was a place where President Lincoln went to give the Gettysburg Address, which became, I think, the most memorized and the most quoted speech in the English language. And finally, it was the place for some 75 years after the battle was over that veterans from the North and the South came together to shake hands over stone walls, to reconcile their differences, and to forge a new nation. During that 75-year period, ended in the triumphal lighting of the Eternal Light Peace Memorial by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1938. And at that time, it was witnessed by some almost 2,000 veterans, average age of 93. And that, of course, was the final gathering of the veterans when they came to Gettysburg. But every year, people come back, and they come back to Gettysburg, and it is a very important place in our history, and one that has a lot of relevance to today. Who do you want to put in charge of a place like Gettysburg? What kind of an individual do you want to have responsible for this treasure? Well, certainly, I think you want three things. One is that you want someone who appreciates and understands the military. It is a battlefield. Second, I think you want someone who understands how this battle, understands the battle from two different perspectives, from both the Confederate perspective and from the Northern perspective. And finally, I think you want someone who can place the events that happened at Gettysburg into the broader sweep of American history. And I think we are blessed to have someone of John Latschar's talents to fulfill this position. He has a unique combination of these three characteristics. Although he was born and went to college in Kansas, he spent his formative years in Virginia and South Carolina. He is a decorated Vietnam combat veteran. And finally, he has his PhD in history from Rutgers and is an accomplished historian. When John became the superintendent of Gettysburg National Military Park in 1994, he found that he had taken on quite a formidable task. He found a very large and significant collection of Civil War artifacts that were literally moldering away in a non-climate controlled basement of the former visitor center. He found the enormous cyclorama painting. The paint was separating from its backing. In fact, the conservators said that within 5 years, that painting would no longer be able to be saved. What he found also was large areas of the battlefield had been overgrown, and it was impossible to see and to understand the troop movements and what the generals saw at the time. And he found that there was very little at Gettysburg that helped the visitors to understand and to put Gettysburg into perspective so that the visitors could understand the lasting significance of the sacrifices that were made at Gettysburg. If you go to Gettysburg today, all that has changed. It's all changed because John reached out and sought partners to help him. And I think what he has accomplished is amazing. You know, I am not going to go in today and talk about everything that's happened in these various areas. I just ask, if you would, to look at the pictures out there, look at what's happening at Gettysburg. Just take some of the literature home with you and read it and look at it. But the only way that you're going to appreciate and understand what John has accomplished at Gettysburg is to come and visit the battlefield. And that I hope that all of you will do that in the near future. Abraham Lincoln, when he made his famous remarks at Gettysburg, promised that we're going to have a new birth of freedom in this country in his remarks. John has really brought a new birth to Gettysburg. It's my pleasure now to introduce John Latschar for his remarks. Thank you.
Well, it is, of course, a very great pleasure to be here in the heart of Texas this evening. And it's a delight to see so many people come out who, I presume, came out because you're interested in thinking just a little bit about Texas and Gettysburg. And that's good. And I'm going to suggest 3 reasons why you should be interested, and perhaps even more interested than you think you might be. First, of course, there's a very direct connection because some of your boys fought and died on the battlefield of Gettysburg. You know that. Second, the American Civil War forged the subsequent development of this, our nation, and Gettysburg certainly holds a very unique, pivotal, central position in the historic perspective of the Civil War. But most important, I think, it's because Gettysburg is a place that can still provide some understanding, not just of the issues which plagued our nation 140-some years ago, but the issues in front of our body politic right now. And I'll suggest a few examples of that as we move along. But before I get cranked up, 3 quick caveats. Number 1, this is not a lecture about the battle and tactics of Gettysburg. If that was your expectation, I can only apologize. But I'm interested in a different level of inquiry, which I call, for lack of a better term, the lessons from the Civil War. And if you read the program, there's a question mark. Second, I'm speaking tonight as a historian, strictly as a historian, nonpartisan, no favorites, either past or present, but one who studies the past and often sees intriguing parallels with the present. So if I do my job right, you should have no idea at the end of the evening whether my sympathies past are with Union or Confederate, or whether my sympathies present are with Republican or Democrat. And third, I want to proudly proclaim that I am the proud father of a native-born Texan. My first daughter having entered the world at Fort Bliss. And that's just in case I don't perform number 2 adequately and am forced to invoke the sanctuary of your famous Southern hospitality. John Hope Franklin once described the art of history as connecting the dots. The more dots that are connected, he explained, the better the history. And in a sense, that's all we've been trying to do at Gettysburg National Military Park for the last decade, connect more of those dots. For there's no doubt that when we started our effort to enhance our interpretation of the Battle of Gettysburg some 15 years ago, the stories we were telling left a lot of basic historic dots unconnected. And by the way, for those of you in the historic and museum crowd, if you haven't heard yet, I'm afraid I must pass on the news that Dr. John Hope Franklin passed away just today at the great old age of 94 in his home in Durham, North Carolina. But John Hope Franklin was also speaking of another kind of connection, and that's the art of connecting visitors of today with the bygone past, with which they have little understanding or familiarity. To be truly effective, Dr. Franklin was saying, historians need to find points of connection between the present and the past. Without those connections, of course, history truly does become irrelevant. But if we can find parallels between the feelings and experiences that are so familiar to all of us today, the hopes and the dreams and the fears that we all have tonight, and if we can show how the same hopes and dreams and fears influence the past, then we can start to establish a feeling of familiarity, of recognition, and of understanding that those distant folks of the past are just like us. All they were trying to do was to cope as best they could with the complexities of their world. So I'd like to tell you a double-sided story. First is how we're striving at Gettysburg to connect more historical dots so that we can tell our visitors a more complete, a more balanced, and a more nuanced story of how this nation descended into the hell of civil war and emerged from it. And second, how we're striving to connect our visitors of today with those events of so long ago, both so they can better understand how those events influence the development of our nation, and so that a better understanding of the decisions made in the past may help us make better decisions today and in the future. Now, our mission at Gettysburg Military Park is to preserve and protect the resources associated with the Battle of Gettysburg and with the Soldiers' National Cemetery, and to provide understanding of the events that occurred there within the context of American history. Now, I don't know how long it's been since some of you have had the opportunity to visit Gettysburg, but we've made some good progress towards the accomplishment of that mission with a lot of help from friends and partners like the Gettysburg Foundation. First, on the battlefield itself, we're enjoying great progress in returning the battlefield landscapes to their 1863 appearance. And the purpose of this is very, very simple. As you come to explore this great battlefield where so many of your ancestors struggled and died, we hope that you can now gain a better understanding of why the generals made the decisions they did, because you're going to see the landscapes just as they did, and what the troops endured as they carried out their commander's orders. And nowhere on the battlefield is this landscape rehabilitation more dramatic than on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg and the terrain covered by Hood's Texas Brigade. Now when you come to Gettysburg, you can see something that people haven't been able to see for 65 years. If you stand by the Texas Monument where Hood's Texas Brigade came out of the tree line, you can now see exactly what they saw, the Union artillery posted on Devil's Den. It brings a whole new meaning to the courage and the sacrifice and the valor of those boys. Second, of course, as Bob mentioned, we have our brand new museum and our visitor center. And thanks to our partnership with the Gettysburg Foundation, we can now say for the first time since Gettysburg National Military Park was created 113 years ago, that our priceless collection of Civil War artifacts and archival materials are now preserved, unimpaired, for the enjoyment of future generations. We can also say for the first time since 1892 that incredible cyclorama painting is restored and may now be preserved, unimpaired, for the enjoyment of future generations. And within a year, we hope to remove the old visitor center and cyclorama building from the Union battle lines of July 2nd and 3rd, 1863, the lines that accepted the impact of Pickett's charge, so that the ground now covered with concrete and asphalt and brick can be restored to its 1863 appearance in honor of the soldiers who fought and died on that ground. And indeed, the old visitor center is coming down this week as we're down here in Texas. Those are our tangible objectives, which are highly visible and easy to measure. When you come visit Gettysburg, you can say, yes, they did this, they did this, they did this. But our most important objective, to provide our visitors with a basic understanding of the significance of the Gettysburg campaign within the context of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, And what that means to us today is highly intangible and impossible to measure. So that's where I'll spend my attention this evening. To be successful, as you good folks know, a good museum must do two things. First, it must take visitors back to the time period in question. In our case, to provide some understanding of those two armies that met on the fields of Gettysburg, who the men were who fought and died there, as well as how they fought, where they came from, the weapons they used, the clothing and equipment they carried, the heroism and valor of both individuals and units, and the suffering and devastation that the battle left behind in that little town of Gettysburg and in homes across the nation who lost their loved ones. All that is vastly important. But even more important, I believe, is providing some understanding of why they were fighting in the first place, the causes of it all, and what did it mean to us as a nation. Indeed, why should anyone care what happened at Gettysburg? Why does it matter? Consequently, we have devoted a fair amount of space in our new museum to putting the Battle of Gettysburg into the historic context of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War. And the same holds true for our interpretive programs on the battlefield. As we connect those historic dots at Gettysburg, we're going to continue to tell the stories of battle and tactics, illustrated by the experiences of military leaders and individual soldiers. These will always be fascinating subjects. After all, stories of how people react under the stress always make good history, good literature, and good drama. But we're now presenting these stories of who shot whom where within the more important historical issues of why were they shooting and why does it matter? And as we introduce our visitors to the story of what the war was all about, we hope it can provide a deeper meaning concerning why those men fought and died on the fields of Gettysburg. But as we introduce these issues of contextual history in both the museum and in our interpretive programs on the battlefield, we are making some folks nervous. Some military buffs, and that's in quotation marks, are concerned that any time at all spent talking about causes and consequences would be time taken away from the true purpose of Gettysburg, which they define as commemorating the battle and honoring the men who fought there. These critics argue that the battlefields were not established to interpret the Civil War, but only to commemorate and interpret individual battles. Again, quote, interpreting the broader scope of the Civil War history, wrote one critic, was not in the mission statement of the battlefields, unquote. That kind of stuff, he felt, should be left to the academic historians. To those critics, we reply that it is not our intent to downplay the military history of the campaign, but to make that military history more meaningful to our visitors by connecting more dots so that we can provide a basic understanding of the social and political and economic influences that produced those soldiers and the armies in which they fought. Other constituents have a more personal concern, which is how the memory and honor of their ancestors will be treated in this type of contextual history. In the words of one correspondent from North Carolina, I quote, "I see the political climate is becoming very dangerous for anything Southern and white. I have never condoned discrimination. I have never denied slavery was the cause of the war. But I'll be damned if I'll sit idly by and let revisionist historians tell me that my ancestors, who owned not one slave, fought to keep them in bondage," unquote. Now, Bob mentioned I was raised in Virginia and South Carolina, so I can assure you I understand that question of honor is still incredibly important to those folks. How can we approach this subject without bringing what they feel might be dishonor upon their ancestors? Part of that answer was most ably pointed out by Professor Jim Mcpherson in his little book, For Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War. If you haven't read it yet, it's a great little read. What Jim Mcpherson was pointing out, and I know we got all kind of veterans in here, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and later, but what Jim Mcpherson is pointing out will ring true to all veterans. The reasons that nations go to war and the reasons that men go to war are often entirely different sets of reasons. Gettysburg is a classic example. By 1863, when those two great armies clashed at Gettysburg, The Civil War had evolved from a war to union into a war for union and freedom. Yet the greatest majority of the 75,000 Confederate soldiers at Gettysburg were not slave owners, as my friend pointed out. Neither were the majority of the 88,000 Union soldiers abolitionists. Yet there they were, doing their best to kill one another. How do we explain it? As one example, I use my wife's great-great-grandfathers who met as enemies on the battlefield of Gettysburg, one with the 88th Pennsylvania, one with the 37th North Carolina, one a Confederate, the other Union. They were neither slaveholders nor abolitionists. So what were they doing at Gettysburg? But if you think about it, it is perfectly understandable why those boys from North Carolina and Pennsylvania chose to enlist under the banner of their respective states. Indeed, in the context of life in the 1860s, it would have been highly unusual if they had not. Indeed, it would have been extremely unusual for the boy from Pennsylvania to join the Confederate Army or the boy from North Carolina to join the Union Army. So to conclude that those soldiers who did enlist thus automatically supported the reasons that their nations went to war is just plain poor history. Some did, some didn't. There are hundreds of reasons, both then and now, that men go to war. I'll give you just one more because it's a personal example. I volunteered, quotation marks, to join the Army and thus went to Vietnam. I surely hope that doesn't mean that my descendants or future historians will presume that I believed in the domino theory. Anybody remember the domino theory? Excellent. Or will presume that I had any intention whatsoever of sacrificing my life or my honor to save the world from the evils of communist domination. No, sir. But in the context of my times, I had four choices. I could be drafted and go as an enlisted person. I could volunteer and go as an officer. I could go to jail. I could flee my country. I took the choice that seemed best for me and my family, and that choice was heavily influenced by the social and the economic and the political context of American life in the 1960s. So as we try to answer this question about honor, we must first ask, how many choices did my wife's great-grandfathers have? And how were those choices affected by the context of their times? Their range of choices in the 1860s was not much different than were mine in the 1960s. And I suspect that their ultimate choice was influenced primarily by what seemed best for them and their families, and only secondarily by the reasons that their nations went to war. I suspect they were just like me, and probably just like you, just trying to cope with the complexities of the world that they lived in. Now, I can think of no better time to ask you to judge our success in providing this deeper level, this deeper version of understanding than right now in the aftermath of a presidential election year. Now, the presidential election of 2008 was faintly contentious, not nearly as nasty as 2004 or 2000. Nevertheless, as we prepared to choose a president last November, the electorate was sharply divided on numerous issues. Each party's faithful held the other party's candidate in a high degree of disdain. We had soldiers dying in foreign lands and sharply contrasting opinions about whether they should be there, what their purpose should be, or how soon they should come home. Voters' opinions about whether the economy was in good shape or bad were, as always, based on where they resided on the economic scale. And just as a footnote, because I always have to pitch my profession, perhaps the last 18 months or so have given you a new appreciation for how influential the economic panics of 1819 and 1837 and 1857 and 1873 and 1893, how influential they all were upon the course of American life and politics. It's just a bit different living through one of these than taking a dry old course in economic history, isn't it? Of course, as we ramped up for the election last November, we also had that usual plethora of contentious social issues that have dogged the last several decades. Access to health care, energy costs, environmental protection, gun control, abortion, gay rights, et cetera, et cetera. Now, undoubtedly, the results of last November's elections and the priorities of our new administration are going to have some effects upon our nation. However, as a historian, I'm just predicting that this is not going to go down in history as one of our most important elections. And you can probably figure out where I'm going. Consider the presidential election of 1860. And consider it from the perspective of where we are today in Houston, Texas. In 1860, the stakes were incredibly high as our young nation drifted towards war. After half a century of conflict and compromise between the free states and the slave states, it appeared that both the ability and the desire for further compromise had been exhausted. Now, the political argument that divided our nation in 1860 was the constitutional question about whether or not states that had voluntarily joined together to form a union could subsequently withdraw from that union. And that legal or political question had been hotly debated from the 1820s through the 1860s with respected public figures taking all sides. But the reason that the question regarding the legality of succession came into play at all was quite simply the debate over slavery. The dichotomy between the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and the reality that the United States Constitution protected the institution of slavery. In 1860, as I'm sure you know, slavery was legal in 15 states and the District of Columbia, which together held approximately 4 million in bondage. And in 1857, just 3 years before the election, the Supreme Court of the United States had ruled that blacks, whether free or slaves, were not citizens under the Constitution. Thus, the Supreme Court of the United States had felt that it had resolved that dichotomy. Negroes were not men in the meaning of the Declaration of Independence and therefore could not be citizens. Much of the nation's population, both North and South, agreed with that reasoning, but many did not. Now, in order to understand how divisive this question was, we must understand how deeply the institution of slavery permeated the entire American economy. In 1860, total investments in slavery in the United States exceeded total investments in railroads, banking, and industry combined. And not just in the South. Entire northern enterprises depended upon the products of slavery, particularly the New England cotton mills, America's very first faltering steps into the Industrial Revolution. The only analogy that can serve to illustrate the economic importance of slavery to the American economy in 1860 is the importance of oil to our national economy today. And I know that not many of us actually own stock in ExxonMobil, but even fewer of us could be easily persuaded to give up our automobiles. I can't overemphasize how truly divisive this question of slavery was. No other question, bar none, before or since, has so divided the American people as that question. Should slavery be protected? Should it be allowed to spread into the Western territories? Should it be contained in the states where it existed, but prohibited from the Western territories? Should it be abolished? Was slavery a moral evil or a benevolent institution designed to care for an inferior race? No question, bar none, has been subject to more petitions to Congress, more congressional debates, more compromises, more anguish, more despair in the first decades of our nation. The acrimony in Congress had grown so divisive and bitter by 1856 that a congressman used his cane to beat a senator into a bloody unconsciousness on the floor of the Senate, which at least puts the general incivility of recent presidential campaigns back in perspective. But at the end, as we approached the election of 1860, all the compromises seemed to have failed. In 1860, there weren't 2, but 4 candidates for president. There was Abraham Lincoln of the relatively new Republican Party, running on a pledge to protect slavery where it existed, but prevent the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. The Democratic Party, long dominant in American politics, was split in 2 by the slavery question and had 2 candidates. The northern wing of the Democratic Party nominated Stephen Douglas of Illinois, sponsor of the popular sovereignty compromise of the 1850s that had led to the Bleeding Kansas era. The southern wing of the Democratic Party nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, a fiery pro-slavery candidate dedicated to protecting the institution of slavery, even at the cost of sundering the Union. And there was another, a brand new Constitutional Union Party, who nominated John Bell of Tennessee on a vague platform that pledged to find some sort of way to protect slavery and preserve the Union. Details to be provided later. Sound familiar? Now, as the election approached, the choices for some seemed relatively simple. For example, in Massachusetts, the home of the abolition movement, there wasn't much doubt about which way the vote would go. Massachusetts had abolished slavery over 70 years before and had a healthy free black population of over 9,600. Moreover, Massachusetts, like the other New England states, was dedicated to that ideal of free labor, which was fueling the first American Industrial Revolution. And so it was. Lincoln got 76% of the popular vote in Massachusetts, followed by Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, with 20%. Nor was there much doubt concerning which way the vote would go in Mississippi, home of the future president of the Confederate States of America. In Mississippi in 1860, there were more slaves than citizens. Slaves constituted 55% of the total population, and 49% of all households in Mississippi owned slaves. There were a few, 773 free blacks in Mississippi, but it was abundantly clear that Mississippi voters intended to protect their vast investments in slave labor system, and they did. John Breckinridge got 59% of the vote in Mississippi, followed by John Bell with 36%. Now, just based upon the demographic statistics, it also seemed obvious that Texas would vote much like Mississippi. 30% of the population of Texas in 1860 were slaves, and more than 28%, more than a quarter of Texas families owned slaves. And so it did. John Breckinridge, the pro-slavery candidate of the Southern Democratic Party, won the state easily with 75% of the popular vote. John Bell got 25%. Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, got exactly 18 votes. Abraham Lincoln was not on the ballot in Texas. You know the outlines of what happens next. South Carolina seceded from the Union 6 weeks after the election, followed by Alabama and then Mississippi, and then Florida, and then Georgia and Louisiana. On February the 1st of 1861, despite the ardent opposition of Sam Houston, the father of Texas, the first president of the Republic of Texas, and the governor of Texas in 1860, the Texas Secession Convention voted to secede from the Union. And then, unlike any of the other seceding states, Texas then held a popular vote to ratify that secession. 75% of the voters, exactly the same percentage that had voted for Breckinridge, approved secession. Governor Sam Houston, refused to take the oath of allegiance to the Confederacy and was removed from office by the Texas legislature. And on March 4th, 1861, Texas joined the Confederate States of America, its third nation in 25 years. Once committed, of course, Texas did its part. Texas was most important as a critical supply state for Confederate forces until 1863, when the Union capture of Mississippi made large movements of men, horse, and cattle more difficult. Over the course of the war, Texas furnished 86,700 troops to the Confederate cause and a little over 2,000 to the Union cause, which meant that 15% of the state's population was in uniform. 15%. Sadly, over 3,800 of those boys never returned home for a death rate, Texas soldiers, of 4.4%. I mean, 4.4% of the Texas population died in the Civil War. Let me turn to Gettysburg. Some of the meaning of Gettysburg. Gettysburg has often been described as a turning point in the Civil War, which it was. But to understand the significance of that turning point, I think we must first understand what was at stake as the troops gathered for battle. In the early months of the Civil War, as you probably know, both sides thought that this war would not last long. A single battle or sufficient determination by one side that the other was determined to stay the course would be enough to cause the leaders to resolve their differences and reach yet another compromise and either restore the Union or let the United States break into two separate nations. But that didn't happen, of course, and the war grew in ferocity and in scale and in losses of blood and treasure. As we approach 1863 and the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederacy appeared to be winning the war. Remember now, in order to succeed, all the Confederate States of America had to do was avoid losing. Exactly what George Washington and the Continental Army successfully did in the Revolutionary War. But the Union, in order to win this war, had even a larger challenge than the British. They had to defeat the Confederate armies, conquer half a continent, occupy hostile territory, and suppress a rebellion. Quite a different task. But the point is, in June of 1863, the Confederacy was far, far closer to achieving its goal than was the Union. Granted, the North had won several key battles out west, occupied some Confederate territory, and kept the crucial slave-holding border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware in the Union. But in the East, the war was not going well at all. The Army of Northern Virginia had inflicted defeat after defeat upon Union armies in the East. First Manassas, and Second Day, and Second Manassas, and Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. Antietam at best was a draw. In early 1863, foreign observers concluded correctly that the Confederacy was winning the war. But in the spring of 1863, both Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis were woefully aware that the Confederacy could not win a long, drawn-out war of attrition. The enormous industrial and manpower advantages of the North would be too much to prevail against indefinitely. And so they decided to take the war to the north, hence the invasion of Pennsylvania. Their purpose, the tactical reasons for the invasion are numerous. But it was not to conquer and occupy territory, for they knew they could not hold northern ground. But the strategic purpose of the invasion was simple, and its ultimate political purpose was obvious. It was to effect northern support of the war. At best, they hoped to capture a northern capital such as Harrisburg or throw panic into Baltimore or Washington. But all they really needed to do to make the invasion a success was to inflict a major defeat upon a Union army on Union soil. For you see, they knew what we often forget, and that is the key to the battlefront is the home front. They knew that the entire civilian population of the North, the home front, was growing increasingly discouraged over the conduct of the war. They knew that Republican majorities in both the Congress and the state houses had been reduced by the midterm elections of 1862. They knew that Congress had instituted a joint commission on the conduct of the war, which was constantly second-guessing Lincoln and his generals. They knew that the northern home front was in shock and dismay over the mounting death tolls. They knew that a victory on northern soil would do more to affect the northern population's will to continue the war than anything else. In short, for those of you of my generation, they were launching their Tet Offensive. That 1968 offensive, if you remember, was an absolute total military defeat for North Vietnam. But it was a resounding political success. And it can mark the turning point of the American people's willingness to support the war in Vietnam. So I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen, that 105 years before Tet, Lee and Davis had exactly the same objective. Now, the fact that this invasion resulted in the Battle of Gettysburg and that the two armies met at this little town of Gettysburg, less than 10 miles inside Pennsylvania, was more an accident of geography and road networks and timing rather than a planned engagement by either commander. But there, 163,000 soldiers joined in struggle for 3 long, bloody days with literally the fate of a nation, our nations, at stake. I won't talk about tactics over much this evening, but I must note that one of the most famous fighting units in the Army of Northern Virginia at Gettysburg was Hood's Texas Brigade. It was organized in October 1861, and it was composed of the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas regiments and the 3rd Arkansas. It was originally commanded by adopted Texan John Bell Hood, and the Texas Brigade was often used by Robert E. Lee as his shock troops. Such was their fame that they were still commonly known as Hood's Brigade, even after General Hood had been promoted up to be division commander just prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, it was led by another adopted Texan, Jerome Robertson. And the Texas Brigade led the heart of the Confederate attack on the afternoon of July 2nd upon Devil's Den, which they captured, and upon Little Round Top, which they did not. Of the 1,729 soldiers who entered battle with the Texas Brigade at Gettysburg, total losses were 602, or 35%. Suffice it to say that the Union won at Gettysburg, as you well know. Although it was not the end of the war, which drug on for 2 long, more bloody years, it was definitely a turning point of the war. After Gettysburg, the Union held the initiative. And as long as the will of the northern population to support the war was unabated, the end was inevitable. Excuse me. So what? What does all this mean to us today? Part of that answer to that question is easy. The Civil War was truly a turning point in our development of the nation, and Gettysburg was a turning point of the war. The Civil War was indeed the most momentous era of American history. It defined both who we are as a nation, then and now, and what beliefs we hold to be self-evident. It was both the greatest disaster ever to befall our nation and also our era of greatest achievement. The Civil War decided once and for all that question of union or succession. Before 1861, you remember, Americans grappled with the permanence or impermanence of the Union as a major political and constitutional question. No more. Although arguments about states' rights did not end in 1865, discussions about the permanence of the Union ended abruptly. After 1865, only fringe groups talk about the legitimacy of breaking up the Union of the United States of America. The Civil War, of course, abolished once and for all the institution of slavery. 13th Amendment prohibited slavery. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship for the first time in our nation's history, and the 15th banned race as a reason for disenfranchisement. Repealing any of those amendments or a return to an unfreed labor system is unthinkable today. Granted, we still struggle 145 years later to refine this concept of citizenship. Viewed in those terms, Civil War saw not only our greatest military struggle, but our greatest social revolution. Another part of connecting the dots with the past is understanding the incredible price paid by the Civil War generation. The breadth of involvement, the depth of commitment, and the scope of sacrifice of Americans that the Americans of the 1860s endured is absolutely astounding to contemplate today. I've already cited a few statistics pertaining to Texas, Well, listen to some national comparisons. In 1860, the total population of the United States was a little over 31 million. 12.4% of that population was in uniform during the Civil War, some 3,800,000 men. 620,000 lost their lives. 2% of our total population lost their lives in the Civil War. If we held a Civil War today, and those same percentages held, we would have 37 million men and women in uniform, and we would have 6 million deaths. We can't even begin to comprehend today how we can cope with the struggle of that immensity that was prolonged for so long. But understanding that they did live through it, I think, helps put some of the issues and struggles of today into a little bit better perspective. So from that perspective, I'm going to ask you, are there lessons from Gettysburg and from the Civil War which had relevance to our presidential election last fall, or which have relevance right now as our new administration charts its course for the next 4 years, that have relevance as we continue to try to cope with the complexities of our world? You need an answer. These are rhetorical questions. But think, and then you tell me. Are the politics of exclusion, which shaped the national debate over slavery for 40 years prior to the onset of the Civil War, are they still with us today? Are there still residents of Texas or our nation who do not have full rights of citizenship? Did arguments in the 1850s over the reopening of the Atlantic slave trade mask the real question of our nation's dependency upon slave labor then, any more or less than arguments about the level of foreign oil imports mask the real question of our dependency on oil today? In 1848, Senator James Hammond of South Carolina asked, and I quote, "Wherever any people, civilized or savage, persuaded by argument, human or divine, to surrender voluntarily $2,000 million of property?" The answer then was no. Has that answer changed today? The arguments then about whether slavery was a moral evil or a benevolent institution designed to care for an inferior race split America's two largest religious denominations, the Methodist and the Baptist, into separate churches, both of which quoted biblical scripture in defense of their position. Is this much different from the biblical scriptures being quoted today in support our opposition of one social agenda or another? In the early months of the Civil War, both sides thought that the war would not last long. Did not that generation, just like ours, have to learn that war, once launched, is difficult to control, has a tendency to become ungovernable, refuses to be managed logically, and takes turns that no one had anticipated? Is Abraham Lincoln's challenge of a new birth of freedom as relevant to us today as it was to our forefathers in 1863? And perhaps more important, because I'm a veteran, both then and now, is understanding that in a democracy, the home front, you and I, are directly responsible for what happens on the battlefront. After all, Sir John Keegan, perhaps the most acclaimed military historian of our time, once wrote, and I quote, "An army is an expression of the society from which it issues. The purposes for which it fights and the way it does so will therefore be determined in a large measure by what a society wants from a war and how far it expects its army to go in delivering that outcome." Is not our new administration right now redefining how far we expect to go in delivering that outcome? In other words, you've figured it out by now. I fully believe that in order to stand armies, good historians must first understand the societies that produce those armies. In order to understand the battlefront, you must first understand the home front. In order to understand the significance of the Gettysburg, you must first understand what was at stake and why as the armies gathered for battle. I think Lincoln understood all that perfectly. Hence his decision to come to Gettysburg in the fall of 1863 and use the opportunity of providing a few appropriate remarks to redefine the purpose of the war, not for his battlefront, but for his home front. Thankfully, not just for his generation, but for ours. Abraham Lincoln once said, "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it." And that, folks, is the relevancy of history, the true mission of museums, the power of putting your feet in the place at Gettysburg. If the new museum and the hallowed battleground at Gettysburg can help us better understand the issues, the trials, the sacrifices, and the struggles that past generations endured to get us where we are today, then perhaps we in turn can better judge what to do and how to do it today and in the future. And if that takes place, then finally we will have accomplished our mission of providing understanding. In closing, let me make just a few final observations. On November 5th, 2008, that was the day after the election, we all got up in the morning and we went about our daily lives. Whether we were encouraged or discouraged by the results of the presidential election, we did not have to wake up with the prospect of our nation dividing asunder. The people of the Civil War generation gave us that assurance that this nation, forged by the fire of the Civil War, is more powerful, more enduring than any single presidential election. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strength of our democracy, of the people, by the people, and for the people, bequeathed to us by that Civil War generation, some of whom were your ancestors. And I suspect if we could ask those old boys about some of the issues facing us today, I'm certain they would assure us that, number one, this nation has survived far, far greater crises in the past than those imposed by the post-9/11 world or by the current economic crisis. Number two, this nation has been far, far more divided in the past than it is today. And finally, as compared to the issues that our forefathers faced in the Civil War era, the issues facing us today should be well within our ability to resolve in a civil manner. And that is our hope for the future. We are now one people, and we do believe in the new birth of freedom. Of course, we have work yet to do. Our part of that work at Gettysburg National Military Park is providing understanding to the millions of people who visit us each year. So I want to invite you all to join us in that mission by coming to visit us, exploring our new museum, and roaming that great battle where so many gave that last full measure of devotion. Thank you.